If we haven't met previously, my name is Phil Strazula. So I run SSR. Our mission is to help HR professionals find and buy the right software. You've probably talked to one of our advisors before if you're looking for an UCM, ATS, etc. And we love to help out. If you need help, please let us know. With me today is Shashi, who's the chief economist at Geographia, specializing in urban economics and demand modeling. A longstanding team member, he brings deep expertise in econometrics, cost-benefit analysis, and economic impact studies. Sashi is particularly passionate about advancing sustainable economic pathways for rural and remote communities and supporting governments in making more efficient and equitable policies and infrastructure decisions. Sashi, thank you so much for taking the time out, especially I know you just had a new baby girl 2 weeks ago and you are somewhat sleep deprived. I'm sure he'll be sharp today, but if he has a few ums and ahs in there, please give him a little bit of grace here.
Thanks for that, Phil. I'll kick off the presentation and the webinar. Thank you for that lovely introduction. By way of expanding on that, I'm a labor economist by training. I'm passionate about technology and shift work and the way it's changing and the nature of where it's expanding and opportunities for businesses to grow in step with workers. Today's presentation focuses on shift that is emerging across labor markets. So what we're observing is not a collapse in employment, nor are we seeing strong expansions in job hiring. Instead, we're observing a period where hiring is slow, turnover pressures remain elevated, what we are terming as a low-fire, low-hire era. In that context, the emphasis for organizations really shifts away from recruitment and towards retention, and where retention becomes a strategy in it of itself. And the central question becomes how to sustain workforce stability when external hiring is less responsive. I think it's important to give context to what is happening in the U.S. economy and what's driving this growth without momentum. What we've observed is, at least in the past 1 to 2 years, is the U.S. economy has actually continued to grow quite modestly, but that growth is uneven and very concentrated. A significant share of that growth is being supported by large-scale infrastructure investments, particularly AI-related assets. And at the same time, we see this sort of contrasting effect in the consumer and worker side, especially with confidence. What we've observed is consumer confidence has weakened to 10-year lows in the US. And this has led to a pace in hiring that has slowed down, where it's created a labor market that appears stable, at least on the headlines, but is losing momentum underneath. And so there's two defining characteristics in this environment, if you will. One is that layoffs remain broadly stable, contributing to that low-fire environment. And there's been largely no large-scale displacement of workers. But at the same time, we have this hiring that has slowed, what we're terming as low hires, where there's fewer vacancies in most selective recruitment processes. And so what this means is that the labor market is cooling through reduced hiring activity, rather than rising unemployment, which is what normally would concern economists. We see this cooling labor market that has tapered down new hires. The implication for this is that organizations is that external labor pool becomes less responsive, and as a result, the workforce that is already in place in your organizations becomes more the most important strategic asset, if you will, for your HR.
Sashi, do you mind if I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Because I had one question for the audience, and so this is really for anybody to share in the chat, because I'm really curious, what are you seeing in your business? What industry are you in, and are you seeing this low fire, low hire sort of dynamic playing out, or not? I'm very interested from that perspective. And Shashi, I'm wondering, are people less responsive now to recruiting because they're fearful, or is there another dynamic here at play that's making them less responsive and therefore we're focused on retention?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Phil. I think let's unpack that, I guess, in two parts. Like, what is contributing to confidence and what's contributing to weakness. So in terms of like the confidence aspect, it is really that AI infrastructure investments. Uh, by way of example, like when we did the analysis, about 10 to 30% of like economic growth in the past year is just coming from this single sector, one single sector. Uh, but then if you unpack that, actually, what we identified was if you took out that AI infrastructure growth, at least in the first half of 2025, US was stepping into recession. And then that sort of uncovers a bit of what's outside in the, I guess, the normal economy, the non-AI economy, that people are and businesses are investing less and people are spending less because of this consumer confidence that has fallen to lows. And so that's really what's driving this labor market momentum slowing down. Basically, it's people rather than um, taking initiative to undertake cost cutting. Businesses are pausing, and workers themselves are pausing as well. And so we're trying to figure out basically what to do with what we have. In the context of businesses, retention is really now the critical factor, I think. And then, sorry,
Thank you
circling
for
back to your question again, was there another aspect of that as well? I'm sorry, I might have not.
no. I really appreciate it. Sorry for interrupting your flow, and
Yeah,
it's interesting to see in the chat here some of the disaggregation of the data across some of these niches. I think a lot of folks are 100% in agreement, and then we've seen a few outliers like Raquel and manufacturing, where it's low fire, high hire, and some of these are growing. So it's just to me super interesting. I appreciate everybody sharing their insights in the chat. Please continue.
yeah. No, and I think to add on to that, it's a nice segue to this slide. So as evidence of that, we can see that job openings have fallen from 9.3 million to 6.8 million. That's like a 20 to 30% decline depending on where you start and end. And it's not because of layoffs. It's not because people are separating from their jobs or businesses are laying off workers. That's actually largely unchanged and remains stable. But what we're observing is something that's really driven by the services sector and the government sector. So in the professional services sector, a lot of entry-level roles are being hit hardest by automation and AI. And there we see a lot of businesses pausing their hiring for new recruits. And that's creating a lot of weakness in terms of like consumer confidence in the services sector, which is a large portion of the US economy. And then you have also in the government side, a softening by way of like the government tightening their fiscal belts, at least at the federal government level. And so that's actually reducing a lot of confidence in businesses, which is a lot of businesses that rely on government contracts or that rely on geographies and cities that are predominantly public sector interfacing. Washington D.C. being a primary example of that. We saw falling levels of recruitment in retail, hospitality, and health that followed the decline in public sector hiring in Washington D.C. So that's just a sort of like microcosm of what's happening in the whole of the U.S. And so the weak economic confidence that is being driven, at least in the U.S. economy, is from that demand side slowdown, and businesses themselves are pausing or at least slowing down on hiring new roles. I think the key insight here is that the economy itself is not weak, but employers and workers are remaining cautious right now in this environment before making their next move. Mm-hmm. Now, what we've observed through research with deputies data is another story of shift work industries. In spite of like the weakening confidence that's seen at least amongst U.S. consumers, the actual shift work sector data tells HR leaders a completely different story, if you will. In healthcare, hospitality, and even in retail to a certain extent, over the past 5 years, we've seen year-on-year gains in hiring. At least in the past year, we've seen a slowdown in momentum that's largely in line with the rest of the US economy, but it's still growing nevertheless. And so I think it's important to note here that when you examine this at a sector level, we uncover that there's actually a lot of growth, at least in a modest level, happening in the shift work sectors. So if we unpack it, for example, in healthcare, demand actually still remains high, although the pace of hiring is beginning to stabilize. And there we see the healthcare employees taking a pause with new hires. The hospitality sector itself is also growing, but also at a more moderate rate. So employers in the sector themselves are also adopting a more cautious approach in terms of expanding head down. And then retail, we have to admit, is the weakest amongst all the shift work economy sectors. Part of that is also, as I mentioned before, is the pace of automation that's happening with logistics and back-end house retail jobs is by and large affecting the sentiment of retail shift workers, and we'll see that in the next few slides as well. With that being said, at least in retail, customer-facing roles are increasingly of value in a competitive environment in the US, and so what we're seeing is placing of higher value in terms of those types of roles in retail and a shift there. And even then, there's still a pause in those hiring of those new roles while businesses wait and see how the economy fares. The key point across these sectors is that not all roles are equally replaceable, but in a slower hiring environment, the loss of experienced workers becomes more difficult to offset, if you will. And this is really in the short term, if you will. That's sort of like the 5 to 1 year window of what has happened in the past. If we take a more long-term view, let's say even over 10 years, the future of work, from what we see, is actually more human, not less. The jobs growing fastest are the ones that technology can't replace. What we're terming as human-centered, where humans are the center of the role and delivery of the service of the product. You can think of this as anywhere between like a sommelier to a surgeon. A human in those roles can't be easily replaced by technology, but technology has an important role to augment and improve the productivity and experience of the worker. And when we look at where the growth of new jobs are going to be over the next 10 years, it's largely shift work jobs. We're expecting to add at least 1.1 million new jobs in the shift work sectors in the US over the next 10 years. And by and large, those are concentrated in these three sectors, in hospitality, in healthcare, and in services. And of the 1.1 million, a large majority of them, 700,000 of them actually, are in healthcare roles. Part of that is because of an aging society, where the demand for healthcare, personal care services, aged care services at home is being driven by an aging and a more affluent American society. In terms of hospitality, that's continuing to rely on service quality and customer experience. Again, very human-centered and growing need for that. And then in the services sector, particularly in personal and community services, we're seeing, again, expanding demand for well-being, increasing demand for roles. So this indicates to me, and from what the data says also, that despite advances in technologies, the greatest levels of growth in terms of areas of employment are the ones that are inherently human in nature. And yet, when we come back to the short term, like what's happening right now with workers' experience, that's not what's being felt by workers. They don't feel the optimism of this growth, this security in their jobs with what's happening right now. So despite operating in this labor market that is growing, work experience differs significantly across sectors. At least in the short term, healthcare and hospitality sectors workers have seen improvements in worker sentiment, and then in retail, on the other hand, we've seen an experience of declines. And what this tells me is that it's important to identify what is not driving these differences. So over the past 5 years, wages have been rising across all sectors. So what we know is like pay alone itself is not driving these differences in variation. Hiring conditions themselves are also the same, where it's a low hire, low fire environment across all these sectors. And all these sectors are also adopting at least the same level of both augmentation and automation type technologies. So we know it's not pay, it's not hiring, it's not technology per se.
Sorry, Shashi. I think I
Uh,
took over here for a second. We get
sure.
back to your slides here.
Uh,
Why don't you click in the content section on the slide that you're at?
oh, okay. Come back to that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, sorry, coming back again to that. So, what is driving difference, at least in worker sentiment or how workers feel today? What we've identified is it's really workplace and culture and the design of jobs that is driving workers' sentiment, how schedules are structured, and how technology introduced, and then overall how management communicates these things. These are like really important for how workers feel about their jobs, about the security of their own jobs, and whether or not they'll stay in their jobs. So if we unpack that a bit more, what we identify, at least like if you take AI and the deployment of AI as sort of like a natural experiment of this, what we've identified is a large majority of workers see benefits realized through the adoption of AI in their jobs. 80% see productivity increase in their roles. 75% of them say that AI helps them leave work on time. So we've seen genuine productivity gains. But at the same time, when you ask them, does AI reduce stress or reduce burnout? We see far fewer of that actually. And the insight here is that technology improves output, but it does not, on and by itself, improves the way workers feel. Employers winning on retention are those that do best both with technology deployment but also management. Another way to describe it is what we've identified is that culture eats AI for breakfast. It doesn't matter how good your AI tool is or whatever technology tool is. The way management communicates the use of technologies and why they're using it is really important. And we can see this in particular when we dive deeper into workers' concerns about AI. Despite real productivity gains, we've identified that workers are very concerned about how and why AI is deployed. So AI anxiety, if you will, it coexists with AI benefits. Sometimes in the same workers' minds, like 60% of them fear replacement, believe that their jobs or part of their tasks will be replaced by AI. 1 in 10 US workers believe that they've witnessed someone or one of their peers lose jobs to AI. 80% of them distrust, believe that it's the tools being deployed are not fully transparent. And so the insight here is that workers, the transparency of technology and the use of tools is what workers care about most. And so trust must be built alongside the capabilities and the use of these technologies as well. Taken together, the data points to a consistent pattern. Although hiring is slow, employment remains stable, and yet worker experience varies significantly through these sectors, and especially in the age of AI and different technologies being deployed, we can see that technology is improving productivity, but it's also introducing uncertainty to workers. And this leads us to a key question. If hiring is not the primary lever for growth, then what becomes your focus instead? And how does retention become a strategy in itself to maintain growth for business? In the second half of this presentation, I'll go through 4 workforce levers that determine whether your people stay and leave. Retention now becomes your primary growth strategy, really. And let's unpack why that is the case. There's 3 factors driving this. The cost of replacing frontline workers can now be up to twice an annual salary. So that includes like time costs and actual like search costs as well. At the same time, turnover rates in high volume roles exceed 40%. So there's a lot of churn happening, at least voluntarily. And a significant proportion of these churns or these departures occur within the first 90 days. So at the same time that these trends are happening, the workforce is becoming younger and experience levels are shifting. What we're seeing is Gen Z dominating a lot of the frontline roles, but millennials moving into management and older cohorts exiting. So managers and HR leaders managing almost like a generational transition, if you will, and a change in cultures of what's happening there. So this is increasing onboarding costs, obviously, but widening the experience gaps and raising the cost of turnovers. And the implication here is that retention is no longer just an HR issue. That it actually it affects operational continuity performance of a whole organization, especially in a low-fire environment like this. And so here, scheduling design becomes not just a strategy in itself, but a retention and equity tool. Uh, this is also very important in the context of the nature of younger demographics coming into the shift work job markets and changing the nature of what they want, basically. And so there's really three things that are driving the changing natures of workforce realities. What we're observing is a greater proportion of workers looking for micro shifts, those shifts that are less than 8 hours, but sometimes between 1 hour and 6 hours. And these are driven by an increasing share of workers who carry care responsibilities, who manage other jobs or education commitments. And these could be anywhere from really young workers like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, even those exiting high school as we speak, to baby boomers, those that are managing grandparent care. These are the types of cohorts that are, as they're taking on new roles, they're looking not necessarily for full-time roles or full-day roles, but micro shifts. What we're also observing is polyemployment coming at decade highs. So polyemployment being when workers take on two or more jobs. And what we're seeing, at least in the US, is workers are increasingly juggling multiple jobs. And so this makes like scheduling conflicts a leading cause of attrition for workers that are not, for businesses that are not aware that workers are juggling these jobs. And then lastly, as I alluded to earlier, 80% of shift workers believe that AI adoption lacks transparency and explanation. And so these opaque scheduling algorithms are a retention risks, not just a compliance list. And so schedule design are ways to recognize these changing natures and beliefs that are happening in the shift workforce and optimize for that. And so what we believe is that there's an emerging model happening, and HR leaders and managers will be part of that process where AI doesn't eliminate or replace scheduling, but it optimizes for it. The AI algorithm assists and humans remain responsible for rosters. So here we believe that technology can reduce administrative burdens and fast track onboarding, but human oversight still preserves worker trust and a sense of control between workers and businesses. And so here, schedule design is no longer just an operations question. It becomes a retention and engagement tool. And employers who design for the changing nature of the workforce, especially flexibility around workers, are better able to retain these workers. As we saw in the previous slide, 1 in 3 workers leave within 90 days, which means recognizing and planning for like micro shifts or polyemployment or more transparency demand in technology tools means a stronger onboarding process to retain those workers. Another factor is pay equity. So pay differences are increasingly influencing how work is structured rather than the base wage rates alone. So we can unpack that across these 3 main shift work sectors, and they have very different stories to tell about pay equity. In retail, customer-facing roles are gaining more value and more importance, as I mentioned earlier, and logistics back-in-house roles are facing more pressures from automation. It turns out that female workers actually make a large majority of those front-facing roles, and male workers are making a larger majority of the back-of-house roles. And what we're seeing is a gender differential in pay gap where female workers now outearn male workers in retail. A very interesting and fascinating trend that's just only occurred in the past 2 years. And this is because demand is shifting towards service and experience roles, and logistic roles are facing automation. So being aware of that differential in equity and allowing for back-of-house workers the ability to have career progressions towards different roles within the organization, different training is going to be really important in retail. In hospitality, pay gaps are largely linked to differences in leadership representation. In large part because there's an overrepresentation of male workers in supervisory roles. So having that pathway for all types of workers, including female workers, is critical for retaining and growing those within your businesses. So it's not just a base wage issue, but it's a structural issue of career progression and recognizing that. And where we see this amplified is in the healthcare sector. So in the healthcare sector, women make up a large majority on deputies platforms. 75% of deputy shift workers in the healthcare are female. And yet, when we dive deeper into the pay equity characteristics, they are highly underrepresented amongst the higher paid specialties and leadership, where obviously male workers significantly earn more. So these patterns reflect differences in role design and progression pathways that need to be clearer, especially as you're looking to retain workers now. And so when they're misaligned, they create retention risks, or when there's lack of transparency about what those pathways are, it creates a risk for workers to leave, particularly amongst high value workers. And then coming back to the question of technology as well, AI governance in itself is a trust and retention variable. We see an overwhelming majority of workers not anti-technology or not anti-AI, but anti-opacity. And on the flip side, a lot of management, the need for management to communicate how and why technologies are being deployed, especially AI. So the primary concern here is the lack of transparency. There is a gap between the perceived risks and the actual observed impacts of AI, obviously. And this gap is really driven by uncertainty rather than direct experience, because we see that there's significant productivity improvements for workers on the tools. So organizations that manage this effectively focus on communication. They provide clarity on what technologies are being introduced, how they will be used, why they're being used, and what that means for workers and their roles and their tasks. And this trust, in terms of AI governance or technology governance, is built through transparency rather than using the best tools in itself. It's a combination of deploying the best tools, but communicating why you're using those tools itself. And so when you put all of these together, retention becomes a system beyond a strategy. Retention here is best understood as not just one single initiative, but multiple things colliding together to create this culture where workers stay, where workers feel protected in terms of the roles and pathways that they already have, where scheduling is keeping in step with the changing nature of what they want and their responsibilities as they move to different seasons of their life, where pay equity unlocks pathways for workers, especially as their roles and tasks are impacted by technology, and by where technology deployment goes hand in hand with transparency about why and how technology tools are used. And when they align, these reinforce each other and improve the overall experience of worker stability. So what does this mean for HR leaders? The key implication here is that organization performance is increasingly determined by retention, especially in a low-hire environment, rather than hiring volume. The 4 areas I discussed are not separate work streams. They're a single integrated system. And the quality of your internal work environment becomes the primary determinant of whether workers stay or leave, alongside the technology you use. Retention outcomes are therefore shaped more by these internal conditions rather than these external labor dynamics. And when these 4 levels of retention strategy, scheduling design, pay equity and pathways, and AI transparency and governance come together, they become strong, powerful levers for retention of workers in new businesses. I'll end the presentation and yield a remainder of time back to Phil to discuss any Q&As coming through from the audience. Any questions there?
We'll try to go through as many as we can, and then we'll also look at the chat as well throughout the next couple of minutes here. And Shashi, if you don't mind, I'll just kind of throw these out rapid fire, and we'll try to get through as many as possible before time is up. That sounds good.
Sounds good.
All right. So, question 1, how should HR approve metrics of retention value to leadership for initiative buy-in? You talked about some of these stats around, cost of replacing people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, so like it's twice the annual wage costs. That's the starting point there. You, career progression and retention, and then, like, sorry, pathways for career progressions and transparencies of like technology. That's what's it's all about in terms of like retention, and the cost of not doing that is twice. When a worker leaves, it's twice the cost of money to find a replacement. I think also the other thing that's important in this environment is the churn factor. That when workers choose to leave, they're leaving at faster rates. What we're seeing is like a third of workers leaving their jobs within 90 days. That's because
Mm.
of the availability of more information, and workers also taking on those multiple roles. It's not that they're necessarily finding new jobs, but they're also, when they have another job available, they're increasing hours in those jobs as well. So in that context, it's an increasingly competitive environment to retain workers, and so that's the news for HR leaders there. That that the cost of replacing and the competition for retaining is just much higher in this environment, and that's
Mm.
what's really important for headline figures in a business. Yeah.
And this is especially for everybody that watches this on demand. I'm going to start a little call to action here that you can download that report one more time because people are asking about data, and there's a heck of a lot of data in that report. So if you're watching this on demand or right now, you can click on that and download that report. Any thoughts on employee resource groups, ERGs, and retention?
That's very interesting. I think so. One thing we've observed is the technology changing the way workers communicate with each other to share information. So I think one thing we've looked into, but it's not actually revealed in the report. So I can talk about it. This is sort of like additional information outside of the report. Is that increasing share of workers are using technology chat platforms in itself to share information and swap shifts before seeking approval from their managers. Uh, what this tells me is that actually, besides transparency of tools, uh, allowing platforms for workers to communicate with each other to share insights is really important as well for building trust between workers and managing communication. So that's something that we've learned, at least from the data itself. It doesn't really speak to the general concept of knowledge sharing, but what we're seeing is that technology playing this inadvertent role of facilitating knowledge sharing. And so, at least from our point of view, the choice of which technology providers you choose is not just beyond uh, can we schedule with operational efficiency, but does the technology invite workers to collaborate? Does it support the culture that you want to build in your business, in your management amongst your workers? And can you facilitate that culture through communication, through messaging, through platforms? So that's what I'll say about it.
Do you have any benchmarks on cost per hire and time to hire?
No, not off the top of my head, but I
Okay.
know in general it's two times the cost by way of the industry average in terms of shift workers for hiring new workers.
What is your outlook as far as the impact AI will have on retention?
this this is the $1 million question basically. I look, I have a view on this depending on which occupation, which industry it is. At least for shift work industries, uh, the impact of I believe will be largely positive, in large part because a lot of these roles are human centered. Like, humans are not easily replaced, and in fact, that they're part of the value of the experience of whether you're at a hospital, for example, Phil, and you mentioned that, where it's not just the delivery of the quality of the service, but how you felt, the feeling of home at the hospital. That's something that technology can't easily deliver. That's a human experience. And so uh, these types of occupations are going to benefit from AI by way of AI not being able to replace it. So technology being deployed to augment the worker by way of like improving productivity. At least now we're seeing that. And then later into the future, improving the worker experience itself. In terms of like professional service roles, I see sort of like another. Uh, it's a different story basically in that regard, and I won't get into that other than I see a lot of vulnerabilities in terms of AI replacing a lot of cognitive tasks, but potentially also unlocking value for workers uh, to develop their own products and services uh, and deliver new types of businesses for workers. So it's the net is I think positive, but the transition to how it gets there is going to be a bit more wild, basically, unlike the shift workforce. Yeah.
Try to do two more questions. This is somewhat related to what you were just talking about. How do you see AI playing a role in job availability and the shift in skill sets for newer grads as well as the current workforce?
Fantastic question. That's a great question. So now, I mean, we all know how AI is being used by workers for deploying more resumes, for writing more resumes, and then AI at the same time use it as the screening process. So there's an increasing like sort of high, screening rate between workers producing job applications and businesses screening for job applicants. Uh, so the net is uncertain with that regard. But one of the sort of long-standing challenges in labor markets is the search process for workers and businesses. Even though with all these modern technologies platform, the way that workers find jobs is still very rudimentary, if you will. The search process is costly, not just for businesses, which I highlighted earlier, but also for individuals. Where do I find those businesses? So I think AI has a significant role to play in developing the new types of platforms where workers and businesses can find each other in a manner that almost at the individual level, if you will. And I think that that's something that we have not yet seen before, but I think that's something that's possible now with the advent of AI.
Thanks for getting to that. And honestly, this whole conversation has been really interesting. Unfortunately, we're getting close to the time here, and I guess my final question is: do you have any specific retention tactics for the HR leaders out there that they can be implementing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, probably the value of communication in an environment where there's so much information and so much noise is so much more it's so high, it's much higher now. The ability to cut through the noise and say this is what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how it benefits you is so critical. I know it's so basic, but what we're seeing with the deployment of technology amongst businesses is they let the technology speak for itself by way of like the benefits it brings to workers. But that's not actually the case. Workers still look to people for certainty, for trust, for transparency, even with technology. And so the ability for HR leaders to communicate the transitions that workers are going to experience, and they're going to experience a lot of transitions in the next 5 years because of technology and the changing nature of work, is going to be so important. And I think we should not undervalue communication to workers there. We're taking them on a journey to the future, basically. Whether you realize it or not, HR leaders are doing that. And so communication is going to be your most important tool for that.
I like that framing. We're taking them on a journey into the future. It sounds very exciting, especially with everything going around, and you can kind of take an optimist point of view here. Shashi, I wanted to thank you again for joining us. Please, everybody in the chat, and join me in thanking him for all of the insights, the data that was shared. And with that, I wish everybody an amazing rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much.